Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm Dino. You may remember a couple weeks ago I showed you how to remove the shock and spring assembly out of the rear suspension of my DR650. Now that shock and spring assembly is going over to Performance Shock and Custom in Welland, Ontario, where my friend Oliver is going to show us how to service a shock absorber like the one in the DR650. So that should be a really interesting video. Today, we're going to remove the remaining components on the suspension. So the swing arm and the lower bell crank assembly that the shock absorber actually attaches to. We're going to take it apart, we're going to inspect it, and if needed, replace the bearings, and if not, we'll just add some grease and service them so we get extended life out of it. So why don't you sit back, grab yourself something warm to drink, and enjoy Dino's Tinker Shed. If we were just going to stop at taking out the rear shock, you wouldn't have to necessarily take off the rear tire or any of this chain guard or any of that affair. But eventually I'm going to want to take this rear suspension off, the entire swing arm, all the bell cranks and everything. So the next thing I'm going to do is take the wheel off. I've shown you how to do this before. It's relatively simple. Basically, you're just going to loosen this one axle nut here, take off the chain guard, and then slide the axle out, and the wheel itself will actually fall straight down. So I'm going to do that now and do it relatively quickly, but in order to get this swing arm off, it has to be done. Now when you pull this apart, there is going to be pieces flying everywhere. Alright, the rear wheel's off, and before I go any further, I want to feel to see if there's any kind of slop in the bearings for this swing arm. Now the way we do this is just grab the swing arm itself and move it side to side. If there's any kind of play in there at all, then the bearings are going to need to be replaced. This one is super tight. There's no movement, perceivable movement at all in this when I rock it. So I'm pretty confident that we're really into just a re-greasing here and not a bearing replacement. All right. I think the next thing I'm going to do is take off this lower chain guide, because when the actual suspension comes out, this chain is captured inside that guide, so I have to open that up. Removal of the chain guide starts by removing these two bolts with a JIS screwdriver. Once these are out, you can then knock out this little plastic piece. It's like a spacer that captures the chain within the chain guide, and you can see it's pretty gross looking. Once that's accomplished, I'm going to use a 10mm socket and pull the entire block assembly off of the swing arm, and you can see I've got some cleaning ahead of me. Okay, yeah. I'm just taking a few minutes here to go through the manual and look at all of the steps that I have left to take off the rear suspension. One thing the manual does talk about is ensuring that you support the motorcycle before you remove too much weight off the back end. Now we've already taken off the rear wheel. Now I need to take off the suspension and the bell crank assembly that the shock attaches to. If I was to just take all of that off, there's a high likelihood that the bike is going to tip forward and potentially fall off the stand that I have it on. Now, to address this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a couple quick clamps that I will attach up in the rafters above the handlebar assembly of the bike itself. Now, from those clamps, I'll use a couple ratchet straps that I'll attach to the handlebar crossbar. I'll tighten them up just enough to stabilize the bike so that it doesn't tip forward or sideways as I'm wrenching away on the rear suspension. This should stop the bike from falling off the stand and ultimately onto my head, which is something I don't want to happen. And it'll give me a lot more confidence knowing that the bike is safe and secure. It's something you really should think about doing if you're going to pull the rear suspension out of your DR650. So let's go back down below there and see what the next steps are to get the rear suspension out. We need to remove the rear brake caliper on these bikes. To do that, I'm going to start by gently removing the brake hose from these clamps. Now, you should be able to just lift these up and slide that brake hose out, just like that. And there's two of these clips, so I'm going to do the same up on the front here. There we go. The rear brake caliper sits on this bracket here. It's a sliding bracket that the caliper can move forward or back on. We need to remove this off of the rear swing arm, so I'm just going to slide it forward and off. I'm going to take this twisty tie gizmo here. I'm going to secure it, and then I'm going to tie it up out of the way on the frame of the bike so that it's not in our pathway here. To remove these nuts, I'm going to need a 19mm socket for the nut itself, and I'm going to use my impact driver for this. And on the other side, I'm going to use a 17mm spanner that's just going to hold the bolt secure. So I'm going to get this ready, and then we'll wrap this off. Again, I like to use a 6-point socket on fasteners like this. They're under a fair amount of torque, so to get them off, sometimes the impact's the best way. And you can see that overall the threads and everything on this are really good. So I'm just going to lift up a little bit, push that out. Didn't even need a dead blow. And then this should come out relatively easily. There we go. You can see that this is actually a hollow bolt as well. It's a fairly specialized unit. I'm going to put this together like this and put it into storage. With fasteners like this, I like to not only label them, but sometimes I'll even draw a diagram on here showing exactly where this bolt is going to fit in that bell crank, just to keep things organized. The swing arm bolts sit under these rubber protective caps, and you can pry these out just with a screwdriver. I'm still going to use a little compressed air here just to clean out any dirt that might have found its way in. On the right hand side of the motorcycle, you're going to see a nut attached to this pivot bolt here. Now that nut requires a 22mm socket, which I have right here. And that, again, is a 6-point socket, so we don't strip that nut. And I'm going to use my impact gun on this. The challenge when you're working by yourself is you have to hold the bolt on the other side. So I'm going to try something different. Let me show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to try something I've never tried before, and that is to zip tie my ratchet to the foot peg here. I'm hoping that when I start wrapping on the other side, it will hold the ratchet with the 17mm socket on the end of the bolt. Otherwise, I'm going to have to get my wife to come out here and actually hold this thing. The pivot bolt on my DR looks really good. The bolt itself is nice and smooth, there's no damage, the head's in good shape. One thing I will tell you though is there is actually a washer on the outside of the right hand side of the bike. But there's only one. It doesn't have one on the left hand side underneath the bolt head itself, which I found kind of odd. I went back and I checked the manual, and sure enough, the parts listing for this, the schematic, does not show a washer on the right hand side of the frame. So basically it just butts up against the frame boss itself. However, on the right side, pay attention for that washer. You don't want to lose it. Before I dig any deeper into the bearings on this swing arm, I'm going to take the time to clean as much of the grease and dirt off of this swing arm assembly itself before I can expose any of the bearings. To do this, today I'm going to use something that everybody tells me to try, which is kerosene. Anybody who watches my channel knows I have a bit of a love affair with brake cleaner. I find it really good for degreasing things. But kerosene is supposed to work better. It's supposed to be a little bit easier on your hands. And honestly, why not give it a try? It's relatively inexpensive. I think I got a gallon for like $20. So I'm going to decant some into this spray bottle and we'll get to work cleaning up this swing arm. Now that we have everything cleaned up, I'm going to actually pull off this bearing cap. And I've cleaned this already, but you'll see it's got like a rubber seal here and a steel washer all combined into one. And that helps protect your bearings. And this surface here is what actually registers on the inside of the swing arm. I'll put this aside. There's one of these on each side. What you're going to see when you take that cover off is your actual seal here. This is the seal that protects all the bearings that are inside your swing arm. And you're going to see this, which is a steel bushing that rides on the actual needle bearings. We're just going to pull this out. Now there's one of these on each side and a larger one that sits in the center to register the bearings on either side of the swing arm pivot itself. This is really clean. There's no scuffs. There's nothing on it. It's in absolutely excellent shape. And you can see that there is some grease on this already. Setting that aside, we can probably look down in there and actually see the needle bearings themselves. This is what your swing arm pivots on right here, these bearings. And they're well coated with grease. I don't see any contamination at all. I'm not going to pull these out. There was a zero slop in the swing arm. These bearings are really good. The seal's really good. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a little bit of fresh grease in here. Some people will clean this out and do all that. I'm not going to do it because it looks uncontaminated. I'm just going to augment by adding a little bit of grease in there with my finger. Here's that little bit of grease. And I'm just going to reach down and I'm going to apply it in and around those bearings. But I'm going to try to squeeze that grease gently into the rollers themselves. And once that's done, I'm just going to reinsert this bushing in and around there. So let's see. There we go. And just gently pushing it down in like that. And I'm actually going to remove the excess grease off of the outside of the seal. And I'm going to do this for one reason, and that is so that dirt does not attract itself to that seal while the bike is actually operating. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and provided it's as clean as this one, I won't need to show it to you. Now that we've re-greased the main pivot bearings here, I'm going to turn my attention to these dog bones that are still attached to the swing arm. I can just tell by feeling that the bearings are in very good condition and there's absolutely no play in the bearings themselves. So these should be really good. It just really should be a matter of taking it apart, cleaning, and then re-greasing these bearings. I would point out that these dog bones are not symmetrical. And in fact, the upper part of these dog bones, or I guess it would be the bottom part when it's installed on the bike, actually the holes for the axle that attaches to the bell crank are offset. And that offset needs to face forward towards the actual swing arm pivot itself. It's important that when you take these off that you put them back in the right positions. For me, I'm just going to take this apart, lay the parts out, clean it, and then loosely put it back together. I'll finish tightening it up when everything's back on the bike and in position. Once the nut's off, the dog bone also slides off, and I want you to pay attention to this washer in behind it. Now in the manual, it will tell you that this washer actually sits outboard of the dog bones, but in reality, the little red arrow here shows you that it should be sitting between the dog bone and the boss. Out of all the bolts, this is the only one that gave me a bit of a hard time. There must be a little bit of rust in here between the bolt and the bushing. Now that we have this bolt out, you can see that there is a little bit of corrosion on this that I'm going to have to clean up on my wire wheel. I'm going to clean the threads as well here, as they've got a little bit of gunge in them. Now's the time to do this. I might even get out the emery cloth and sand this as smooth as I can before we reinsert it. All we do now is we can push out the actual bushing. And I might clean the inside of this with a nylon brush just to make it a little bit cleaner and wash it out. But inside here looks just fine. I'm going to apply a little more grease in there and then we'll just put it all back together. With the bushing nice and clean, I'm just going to gently slide it past the seal here and through the bearings until it's flush. I'll clean up all of the excess grease again to reduce any dirt buildup, and then I'll apply a smear of grease onto the bolt itself to stop any rust in the future. With the washer and dog bone installed on the bolt, I'll slide it in from the backside and then once again clean up any rogue grease here. Following that, the washer and dog bone assembly go onto this side, and then it's capped off with this lock nut. Now I'm just going to run this lock nut up so it's snug so that I can tighten it on the bike, but boy oh boy does it ever feel good now that it's been relubricated. The last component that I want to take out and service is the bell crank itself. And again, there is really very little play in this at all. I think it's in good shape, so I just want to take it out and clean it up. The challenge here is I cannot get a socket to use my impact on this side. So I'm just going to take a spanner and lift this up. I'm going to put the spanner right on there. Now this again is a 12-point spanner, which I'm not really fussy on. And you can see it's going to touch right here. So now I'm going to see if I can just give it a couple whacks here and break it free. This is why I wanted to do this one last, is it is definitely in a bit of an awkward spot here. Eventually, I'm hoping I can turn it with the socket itself right here, and I think I'm to that point now. There we go. Sequencing is super important to get these kinds of things apart. And you can see the nut's off nice, it's not damaged. And now I can take off the ratchet and the bolt itself will come out. And here is the bell crank. So I'm going to bring this up and put it up onto the bench. I'll start servicing the bell crank by cleaning the gunge out around the actual shock mount here. There's a bushing and a seal here. I'll clean it all up, and then I'll just use a little bit of brake cleaner to actually clean the gunge off the rest of the bell crank housing. The bushings for 2 of the pivots on the bell crank use these washers with rubber seals built in. These were in really good shape. There was no cracking, no damage to them. So I just cleaned them up with a little bit of brake cleaner and then went ahead and repacked each one of the bearings. Overall, the bell crank was in great shape. There was no damage or cracks to it. So it really was just going through and adding a little bit of grease and servicing it for many, many miles to come. All right, now that it's all clean, it's really just a matter of reassembly. So you're going to want to make sure that this goes in the right way. This thinnest piece faces the back with the U facing up. So I'm just going to slide this in and then put the bolt in over on this side here. Like that. And look at it, it works really good. One of the challenges here is you're supposed to torque this nut to 75 foot-pounds. And unfortunately, I can't get a torque wrench in on this side over here because there's no room. I'll see if I can get my torque wrench in on the bolt head side, even though that's not really where you want it. You want it on the nut side, but I'll see what I can do here. One of the things you may or may not have noticed is I have the chain off right now. When you take the swing arm off, you can actually take the chain off and clean it without having to break the links because you're actually removing the swing arm pivot. Don't forget after you're done cleaning it to reinstall it before you put the swing arm back in, or you'll either have to take the swing arm back out or break your chain. I choose to put it in now to make it much simpler. It basically just slides in between the frame and then up and over top of your front sprocket. And when you put the swing arm in, you want to make sure you go through this hole here. It's a good tip to get a really, really clean chain. It's really easy. It's time well spent. Reassembly of the actual swing arm is the exact opposite of taking it out. So I'm just going to pull the actual axle out here and set it aside for a second. Then I'm going to make sure that the chain is in the right place. So you have to step the actual swing arm through like this, and then it should slide up into place here, making sure you don't lose any of the parts. And this is a tricky thing to do, obviously, but I think we're able to manage it here. Let's see. There we go. I went a little further than it needed to. I'll back it out. In goes the axle. And this is where you may need to move it around a little bit, but eventually you'll get it to come through like that. And now it's back in place. Remember, you need to put your washer in first, and then your locking castle nut. Maybe easier to thread this in using the socket. There we go. Now I just need to torque this down. Torque for this nut is 57 foot-pounds. So I'm using my 1/2-inch drive torque wrench, and I'm going to run it up to that torque. That's it. I'll put the caps back on, and the swing arm is now done. After a quick coat of grease, I'm going to slide the actual bolt through here, and we'll torque this one down as well. I'm just going to wipe that little bit of grease off there. Wow, what a difference. Even though the bearings were in very good condition here, that extra lubrication and I think cleaning up all the gunge packed around the actual swing arm assemblies makes that swing arm feel amazing. And again, there's zero play in that rear end at all. That swing arm's as tight as the day it came out of the factory. So I'm pretty confident in reusing the original bearings. That brings us to the end of today's video on servicing the rear swing arm and bell crank assembly on my DR650. Now, many people out there believe that Suzuki does not put enough grease in these parts when it comes from the factory, and I'll be honest, it looks like mine's been apart, so it's not really a good representation of what Suzuki puts in there. But even if there is enough grease in there, it's never a bad idea to take your suspension apart and service it every 2 or 3 seasons if you have the ability to do it. And if you ride in a lot of wet or dirty conditions, it's even more important to service it like this when you can. All that I have left on this particular project now is to get the shock and spring assembly back from Oliver and reinstall it in the bike, put the airbox back in, put the seat on, that kind of thing. We'll do that in another video because there's a few things I do want to talk about with the shock when it gets back into the shop. Until then, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please leave a comment down below. Let me know your experience with the suspension on the DR650. If you really did like this content, please consider liking and subscribing. Again, it helps me to understand how the channel's doing, and I actually see the subscriptions rising pretty fast compared to earlier in this channel's life cycle. So I'm so thankful to everyone out there who subscribed. All right, I got a little bit more cleaning to do. I guess I'll see you again here on Dino's Tinker Shed. You have yourself a great day.